Hello, welcome back to Game Programming with Unity. I'm Nicholas Bernhard Zeman, and in this section, what I'm going to show you is something called a prefab. Now, a lot of people have difficulty with the concept of a prefab. It's really easy to create one, but to understand the connection between the prefab and the object inside of your scene, as well as the asset inside of your project directory, requires a flexible brain. We kind of have to understand how all of the data is being passed from one node to another. So let's first just talk about how to create a prefab and why do we need a prefab. All right, what a prefab is your object with all of the components and all of the parameters and all the things that you add to it inside of the game, saved into kind of a data structure which retains all of this information. Why do we want a prefab? Well, we want to take all the stuff that we put onto our character or a weapon or material or anything that's happening inside of our game, any object in the game, if we want to be able to bring it into any other part of our game, any other scene, if we want to be able just to randomly pop it in or spawn it, like maybe a zombie could spawn somewhere, we want to save all that information and be able to just call it up at any moment. So what I'm going to do here is show you how to make the prefab. Now, making the prefab is pretty easy. It's maintaining the relationship between the game object and the prefab that gets a little bit tricky. So let me show you how to do this. All right, so I've gone ahead and added a little bit of animation to this character here, our floater rig. And I'm going to delete this guy here. Let's just make it a little bit less confusing. So here's our floater guy, and I'm going to click on play. This is going to start the game engine. Now I've created a little bit of an animation and cause it to play like an idle, kind of a loop. Okay, I've done it by creating a few pieces and structures, and if I select my floater rig, you can see over here I've got a transformer, I've also got an animator, and it's using what's called an animation controller. And we're going to get into all that stuff later, but what I want to do is just show you, I got stuff on this guy. I can even add, turn that off, I'm going to add some physics stuff. We'll create a sphere collider around him. And let's just turn that radius up a little bit. Oops, or down. Well, it's really hard to see that sphere collider. It's gotten huge. There we go. This sphere collider is some type of physics element, so we can create collisions. I'm going to create that collider, and I just want to create an extra component there so we can save all these little parameters. All right, so now I've got a couple components here. I've got an animation. I want to save all this stuff. I want to be able to call this guy out and spawn him like an enemy to have him attack the player. What I can do is, see how I have an assets folder down here? It says prefabs. I can just drag this down into the asset directory. And boom, it's created this as a prefab. Now here's where things get a little bit tricky. Understanding what the difference is between this floater rig, which is a prefab, this floater rig, which is a game object, and this floater rig, which is my original asset. Okay, so let's kind of reverse engineer this. All right, what happened with the original rig? Well, I took this original rig and I dropped it in the game, right? And then I did stuff to it. Let's just move this guy over here. I changed some materials. I added those eyeball materials. I added the animation controller, and I added some physics stuff, right? So if I drag and drop this guy into this game, I have to make all these changes to this. Let's delete that here. Okay, I added all that stuff onto the guy, and then I created an asset out of the game object. So the difference between this asset in rigs and this asset in prefabs is that if you look at this asset, it in the inspector shows me the components that are applied to it. And let's open up the rig here. If I select my rig here, this asset is my 3D asset. It's an FBX file. It gives me the options for how to interpret this. Will changes to this change this? Yes, they will, because this floater rig prefab is dependent on this floater rig FBX file for its data. And will changes to my game object make changes to the prefab? And the answer to that is actually no. Why? Because this game object, unless I choose to apply any changes that I make to this game object, it's an instance. and this is a saved version of that instance. And this is what causes people to go crazy sometimes in Unity when they're dealing with prefabs, because they don't know exactly what piece of data they're looking at, and they don't know how changes to one will affect the other. I'm going to show you a little trick here, and if I'm making changes to this guy, let's say, here's my floater rig, here's my sphere collider, and my radius is 0.1. Here's my, if we drop it over here, we'll see our radius here. Now, if I select my original one, and let's change the radius of my collider to be much bigger, and let's say it's 0.22, we double that in size, this guy will not change. Why won't he change? Because I haven't told him to yet. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to, up here where it says prefab, we have 2 or 3 options. Select, I can select that prefab, which will select the prefab down there. I can apply my changes from my game object to that prefab, or I can revert my game object to the original prefab. So if I click on revert, it'll go back to the values that the prefab contains. This is really important because once we start adding a whole lot of parameters for our characters and objects and things in scripts, and we have tons and tons of these float values and things that we need to save, sometimes we mess up the game guy and we just want to pop him back to where he was in the prefab. It's very tough to manage all this data. And that's the thing about games. There's a lot of data, it's a lot to manage, and it's a lot to keep in your head. So when we're dealing with the prefab, we really want to be careful about what's the important object, or what's the object we're referencing. Are we going to apply our game object changes to a prefab, or are we going to apply our prefab changes to the game object? And what I'm going to do here is my game object, I'm going to go back to 0.2 here. Now, if I click on apply, that means there's a connection between that prefab and the game object, and I just took all of my parameters from a game object and stuck it onto my prefab object. And interestingly enough, if you see my other prefab object that's got a connection, it changes too. So when I drag a prefab into a game, it has all the connections carried over from and connected to from that prefab. However, the original object I created the prefab from does not have that connection downstream from the prefab. It's very difficult for some people to grasp, and a lot of times even experienced Unity developers forget that the game object they've got here, they generated a prefab from, so the prefab has a downstream arrow coming from the game object. But when I drop the prefab into the game, now that game object has an upstream arrow coming from the prefab. It takes a while to understand that. And what a lot of people do in this instance is they take the original one and they just delete it. And then we just drop the prefab in. And that way you know that every game object you have here is going to assume the parameters. And see, there you go. Let's just zoom in here. I changed that to 0.1, and the game objects that are deriving their information from the prefab all change at the same time. So oftentimes what happens is you'll have that original object that you generated a prefab from, and when you make changes to the prefab, it doesn't update the original object. And there's always one guy, one of your characters that is instance, one of your zombies or one of your aliens, enemies, is always acting really weird or doesn't act like the prefab changes. And that's because the guy that you made the prefab from doesn't have a connection to the prefab. He's giving the prefab information. So his information is upstream from the prefab, where the other enemies that you created in the game from that prefab, those enemies are downstream from the prefab. So it's very difficult to get that distinction, but it's very important to understand because prefabs are vital in being able to spawn enemies.